Hey everyone, I just want to hop on real quick and try to give you some context for our first unit because it may seem kind of weird that we're really focusing in on this one historical and political moment of the French Revolution and like this is a British literature. Why does French Revolution matter? Well, the Romantic period's approach and thoughts and processes are really rooted in this French Revolution. Authors are heavily impacted by this. Society itself is impacted by what Lynch calls the promise, then by the tragedy of the great events in France. And the ideals behind the French Revolution really are going to dominate this age and become something that people really are excited to discuss, like what is liberty and is justice and how can we have equality and social in society when we have this strict hierarchy. And so for a long time, England's followed what we would call kind of like the chain. It's called the chain of being, and even though it started changing some of the time period before this time periods, it's still around, and arguably we see it still today. In that really rigid social class that you're not really supposed to move out of. And this French Revolution really shakes that to the core, and people become very interested in having this discussion. Also, what you may not know is not long before the French Revolution, England went through its own civil war and like got rid of the monarchy because they felt like they had too much power. And then they brought them back. So the French Revolution is going to also cause some like concern of, oh no, are we going back to that point in our history itself? So in July of 1789, the French revolutionists stormed the Bastille. But in August, they published their Declaration of the Rights of Man. In October, Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette are held captive. And so this is a very quickly moving moment. Things are being shaken. And then by November of 1789, we start having a pamphlet war in England. Richard Price is going to deliver a sermon called A Discourse on the Love of Our Country, in which he's praising the revolution. And according to Lynch, Price speaks with religious fervor to two other revolutions, both glorious, meaning the American and French. So for him, he's like, the American Revolution, the French Revolution, they're glorious and like wonderful, and he really praises them. So now we have a bunch of responses that start going, and because the printing press makes things a lot easier to be printed and thoughts to be shared, we have what we call a pamphlet war, where pamphlets, letters, quick essays are just flying back and forth and being published, and there's this huge discussion happening. So that's what we're reading in the first half of this week, is three of the most influential responses to Price's sermon in this period, and they're all from markedly different viewpoints. And so what I need you to know going into it is that you are going to have a conservative, more liberal, and then like still liberal, but just different approach to things response to Price's original sermon. So yes, they're discussing the French Revolution, but they're also engaging in a conversation between each other, even though it's like written and publishing at different times. They're all piggybacking. I think the two liberal pieces can be more understandable, Wollstonecraft and Paine's. Students often feel like they can interact with them a little bit better. Wollstonecraft is going to be a little bit more elevated in writing than Paine, but she also is very fiery, and she's going to really go after Burke, who I'll talk about in a second, argument and his rhetoric, meaning like the way he communicates, and really talk about how like, no, this is great. Later we'll read a second piece by her, in which she talks about the rights of women. So that will tie in really nicely together, and we'll see her again. So yes, she's liberal. She's probably like the medium difficulty of them all, because she is using more elevated speech and rhetoric, but she's also trying to be more relatable so that anybody could connect with her. Thomas Paine is speaking to the common person. That's what he's known for. That's his writing style. So I think you guys will be okay there. I do want to address Edmund Burke because he's a bit of a wild card, I think. He was a politician for 29 years in Parliament. But what's interesting is he's not always one and the same. He heavily supported the American Revolution and was like, yes, free the colonies, let them go. And yet now we are at the French Revolution, and he's very against it. He's like, no, hold tight to history. So he might feel harder to understand. So I want to give you some context for it. He is born and educated in Dublin, which is going to impact some of his views because Ireland was treated horribly by England. He comes to study law, but he also really gets involved in philosophy. And so that means then from there on out, his political views and his approaches really are informed on his insight into human passion, as one critic says, from the previous period of the Norton anthologies. And another critic that I read talks about how he is strongly against absolutist approaches to human problems. He appreciates culture and loves culture and things like we don't want to get rid of culture, but he also thinks there's no absolute approach, which is why he loves the American Revolution but hates the French Revolution. He is very fond of keeping up with traditions, which means we want to keep the hierarchy that we have in society because it exists for a reason. And if we don't have that hierarchy, things are going to fall apart. We're going to descend into anarchy and just get really violent and aggressive. And so that's one of the reasons he's so sensationalizing what's happening, because he wants the upper class to agree with him. He wants to get the sympathies of men and women in the upper class and the aristocracy, even maybe upper middle class, to get them to understand, no, hold tight to this, stand firm against the revolution. Don't let it cross the channel into our borders, because we need this hierarchy and we need this tradition in society, or else we're going to lose everything and people are going to go crazy and violence is going to spread. He's like, look at France, they're already super violent and hurting people who don't deserve it. And so, yes, he writes an elevated way because that's who he's speaking to. So I want you to be prepared for that, but also know that his viewpoint is protect society by holding to tradition, which, we could have a really good discussion about that, but that's where he's coming from. So hopefully that gives you a little bit better context to be able to understand why he says what he says and what he wants. As he moves forward. And I think some things as you're reading, you can think about, is that holding to tradition? So why does Burke say that people do have rights, but only in relation to their position? And what does that mean? You can look at the fact that Wollstonecraft is going to politicize politeness. So what does being polite mean, and how does she use that politically? How would each of the writers define liberty? That's a different view from all of them. But eventually your discussion board prompt is going to ask you to talk about the accessibility of the three. Accessibility does not always mean I can access it. I can pull it up on my phone. I can download the book. No. Here we're talking about the accessibility as in the language. So think about who was their intended audience, and for that audience, is that author accessible? Could people understand what they're saying? Could they have agreed with what they're saying, or would they have spent the whole time trying to figure out what does this sentence mean? You can also talk about, since these are being published where anyone could buy them, how accessible are they to any audience, and does that change things? So hopefully that gives you some kind of context of what we're going into and what we would have discussed if we were a seated section. If you have any questions, let me know.